That would be fun. Welcome, everybody. I'm Daisha Harwood, Executive Director of Santa Barbara Historical Museum. Welcome to the charming Covarrubias adobe. Hopefully Neal can tell you guys a little history of this building a little bit later on, but if you haven't been in here, this incredible building is actually from 1817, and it is incredibly difficult and expensive to maintain. So if you're not a member, please become one tonight. And on that note, in our audience tonight, we have Sheila Snow, one of our trustees, and also our president, Hillary Burkemper. If you have not already visited, please take a look at California Missions by Edwin Deacon. It is an exhibition that we partnered with the Santa Barbara Old Mission Archive Library on. And also Project Fiesta, which will be up just through the end of next week. Project Fiesta this year is really to take us into the centennial year next year, and it's our favorite photos from the museum's Glen Hill Library. Just a quick reminder for all of you members, we have our member appreciation celebration and also the opening of our next exhibition called Seasonal Soirees. It's going to be a fun ladies' evening wear exhibition that opens on December the 8th. So you should all be receiving an invitation in the mail this weekend, but just in case, please ask questions of Jeannie or myself or Emily. And without further ado, does everyone know Neal Graffy in the audience? Okay, well, just in case. So Neal first gave voice to history here in 1989 when he premiered his first talk on Santa Barbara history. He has made innumerable appearances on local television and even C-SPAN here at the museum when he was talking about the Flying, which was really fun. For those of you that do not know Neal, he served on many organizations' boards, including ours. The Santa Barbara County Landmarks Commission, the Mission Canyon Association. He was the sheriff for the Santa Barbara County Corral of Westerners. And he was also a founding member of E. Clampus Vitus. So without further ado, my last announcement is if you haven't already bought all of Neal's books, we also sell them. So anyway, Neal, come on up.
You sort of set me up here to ask if I knew something about the Covarrubias adobe, so to keep us in tune with tonight's talk, I can tell you that John Peck Stearns did not sleep here. So we're done with that. All right, well, tonight's talk is about John Peck Stearns and Stearns Wharf, the history of John Peck Stearns mainly, and this talk is, as my little saying there says, so much history, so little time, because that's Stearns Wharf, 151 years. There are so many stories and so much fun about the wharf. But I thought I would start with the talk about John Peck Stearns, because everything we know about John Peck Stearns is he was a one-legged Vermonter, and I was to question that. Why is he always a one-legged Vermonter? It's like a varietal. You got your one-legged Vermonter, you got your two-legged Vermonter. Don't see many three-legged Vermonters, but he's always described as a one-legged Vermonter who came out from Vermont to California to Santa Barbara, built a wharf. The wharf later burnt down. Hal Conklin rebuilt it, and then it opened and burnt down again, and now it's open after 150 years. So that's pretty much all we get about it. So I wanted to go back a bit further and really talk about who this gentleman was. And this is going to be a talk that's going to take us 3,000 miles from Newport, Vermont, to Stevenson County, Illinois, to Santa Cruz, California, and to Santa Barbara, California. But first, since we're on the topic of wharves and lumbers and ships, who was the first lumberman in Santa Barbara? I hear whispers, but no answers. Well, the first lumbermen in Santa Barbara were the Chumash. Trick question. The Chumash waited for redwood logs to float down, probably from Santa Cruz, because that's the best place for redwood to come down the coast from. They would get the logs, they would split them up into planks, they would drill holes in the planks, put them together with sinew, patch the planks together with tar from the beach, and they would make these incredible swift craft called tomals, and that's what they looked like when they were done. So basically, they were our first carpenters and the first lumber people in Santa Barbara. Leaving them ever so quickly, we moved to 1782 when the Santa Barbara Presidio was founded. And unlike the Chumash, who had been here for thousands of years and could live off the land, the Spanish didn't know how to do all this stuff. So when they first came here, they only had what they brought with them on their backs. So anything they needed that broke or had to be updated had to come by ship. Supply ships came once a year. They would anchor off Santa Barbara, and this is the first drawing of Santa Barbara from 1793. And I blew it up a little bit here and colored in the Chumash houses down along the beachfront. And everything had to be loaded from offshore about 2 miles out, rowed ashore, delivered, and then whatever had to go back to the ships from our mission or from the Presidio to be distributed to other places, all had to be rowed out, lifted back onto the ship, and then away they sail. Well, things didn't get any better for the next 30 or 40 years. It was the same thing. Now in the 1820s, 18 teens, we have ships coming from back east, and they are bringing great cargo from Boston, which the people in California are really looking forward to. Chairs, tables, they don't have anybody making these things really here. So fine crafts coming in from back east. In return, we're giving them hides and tallows. And once again, everything is loaded onto a ship, put onto a small skiff, rowed ashore, and rowed back again. And for our hide and tallow trade, here we have these gentlemen here carrying the hides out to these ships on the tops of their heads through the surf, and back they go. Then the ship goes all the way back to Boston. And we're going to follow that ship, not to Boston, but just a little bit further to northern Vermont, to the town of Newport, Vermont. And Newport is on this wonderful lake, which is nearly unpronounceable. It's called Lake Memphremagog. And it's an Algonquin Indian word that means where there is a big expanse of water. Apparently they had never seen the Santa Barbara Channel or the Pacific Ocean, but the lake was good enough for them. So it was there that John Peck Stearns was born in 1828. And actually, I like this picture of him, but this is what he looked like when he was born. So it's not like he was, grew out of his mother's forehead like the Greek gods there. So let's get on to it. Here's John Peck Stearns. Much better. Born August 18th, 1828. He was the 9th of 14 children of Shubale and Lydia Stearns. Now, Lydia Stearns I like because her maiden name was Lydia Carpenter Peck. So John Peck Stearns, mother's maiden name, a normal common thing to do back then. And I like it that because of her middle name, Carpenter, he's got a little bit of carpenter in him that way, which also works out for his future years. Now, John attended school in Newport. This is the school that he attended, Athenian Hall, built in 1836. It still stands. And one of the great stories about it is as it was being built, there was a workman up in the rafters, and he slid off the rafter, went down 3 floors, and landed in the basement. He didn't die, but for the rest of his life, he was known as the first man to have gone through the institution. That's a local Newport joke for you. So the building later became the Brownington Academy, so same building, and that's where he got his higher education. And it still stands today. It is the Old Stonehouse Museum in Newport. So they were very nice people. I had extensive conversations with them, and they don't have much on him, but they gave me the story. Here's the story they gave me about him. At the Brownington Academy, there's a story of a John Stearns who around 2 o'clock in the morning, this was a boarding school, he gets up at 2 o'clock in the morning and takes a cannonball and rolls it down the hallway, scaring the, and they quote, bejesus out of all the students and faculty there at the Brownington Academy. So that's where he first makes his mark into Newport history. What's that? Yeah, that's something this is a good point, his leg. I have never found out how he lost his leg. Just don't know anything about it yet. But I do have something on it, but It's here in the museum. Dacia, don't we have it down in the vault? So in 1850, he's 22 years old. He leaves Newport, heads 1,000 miles to Stevenson County, Illinois. Now, I don't know what in Stevenson County, Illinois he was looking for, but I did find that his leg, someone says. What an audience. So, but I did find going through old records that there was 2 people named Stearns that lived there. Going through genealogy, I could not find any direct relationship between he and they, but nevertheless, it's very convenient to have 2 people in the middle of nowhere that he goes to. And he's very interested in education, so it seems more than likely that he was teaching in the small school that was there somewhere in Stevenson County. So he stays there for 2 years, and then he leaves and heads for California for the gold rush. And he's 4 to 6 months on the trail, and he arrives at Redding, Sacramento River, August 27th. And I know the day because it's in his autobiography. He has a small thing in one of the bio books in Santa Barbara. He says, I arrived here August 27th, 1853. It's not really known if he took part in the gold rush or not. More than likely he didn't. His years between arrival and the late 1850s are sort of clouded, but most accounts state, and I can't find any direct evidence of it, that he was a teacher, which is probably so, a teacher in some of the schools in the area. But he does show up in Santa Cruz, and outside of Santa Cruz, a town called Soquel, which is now Capitola, about 5 miles away from Santa Cruz. And there he's teaching school and he's studying law. And in April of 1860, he passes the bar and is now able to practice law as an attorney. What's even better is 2 months later, he's the district attorney for Santa Cruz County. I'm going, he's got to be a brilliant guy in 2 months' time, or else they really had a hard time finding district attorneys. So he's the district attorney. He's reelected again in 1864. He's also involved in a lot of other government activities. He's involved with road building and road assessing. He's also the gentleman that's called upon by the state to help assess the division of the Monterey and Santa Cruz counties. He's also a staunch Republican. He works on the local and state levels for committees and conferences and finding people to run for office, which will really pay off in a few years here. But education still remains one of his priorities, and as such, he's no longer teaching, but he becomes a school trustee. A teacher at the school in Soquel, possibly hired by Stearns, is this lovely young British lass, Miss Martha Turner. And apparently they had an attraction because they got married in October of 1862. 14 months later, they had a daughter, Leonora Electra Stearns, and doesn't she look a lot like her father? This is a kind of a funny thing, like it is because you're laughing, but there is only 2 pictures I have ever found of John Peck Stearns. The guy has done so much, and there's only 2 pictures, so I've got to really scratch it to find photographs of him, especially as a baby. So he's still involved, district attorney, studying the law, practicing the law. And then in 1864, he's no longer district attorney. I think he just resigned from the part. And he heads up to Watsonville with his family. And there he practices as an attorney, and he's also a notary public. And he and the family stay there for the next 3 years and just hanging out in Watsonville. Meanwhile, so while all this is going on, California, since the Mexican-American War, we had all these people coming in here from back east with the various regiments for fighting in the California War, which actually didn't happen, but they brought all the guys out here anyway. After the war, they decide California is a great place and great opportunity. These guys bring back with them from back east that Yankee know-how and can-do. And there's the gold rush, and California's booming. They need housing. And so these guys look at the redwoods in Santa Cruz, Mendocino, all these places, and say, well, we need wood. Here's wood, and here's how. So we start having a huge logging industry. And since we are in Santa Cruz, we're in Soquel and Capitola, there's a lot of lumbering going on. So redwoods are cut. They're then taken to the mills. And I like it on this one, on the far left, there's a flume. So one of the ways they got these trees to the mills was they sent them down flumes, so they had a lot of water and a lot of wood to build these things, or they dragged the trees to the mills. From there, the wood was cut and shaped and stacked, put onto carts like this, and taken down to the ocean front, and because we're in Santa Cruz, this is the ocean front at Santa Cruz, and the lumber schooners are loading up with lumber to head down the coast to the communities like Santa Barbara that don't have a lot of trees. So this is a whole industry coming out of Northern California and supplying Southern California with the wood that they need to build their communities. And this is where we find John Peck Stearns in 1867. He has left Watsonville with his wife and family, and he comes here not as an attorney, not as a district attorney, not as a notary public, but he comes here as a lumberman. What does he know about lumber? I have no idea. He may have watched it being cut, maybe watched it being shipped, but he's been an attorney all this time and in the law practice. But he comes to Santa Barbara and says, I'm going to be a lumberman. I do note in the 1870 census, in parentheses after lumberman, it says attorney. So apparently he was doing stuff on the side to keep going. Now, many histories state that Mr. Stearns was the first lumberman in Santa Barbara. I find this is not so. As best as I can find, the first people that were lumbermen in Santa Barbara were Roswell Forbush and Thomas Dennis. Each of those guys is worthy of a talk about themselves. But 1855, they're lumber merchants, and they're also advertising in the paper, both in English and in Spanish, because more than half the people here are obviously Spanish speaking, so they make sure that they cover everybody. Now, the two houses that you see there, the one on the right is the third wooden house built in Santa Barbara, built by Thomas Dennis from his own lumber at the corner of State and Montecito Streets. The one on the left is the second house built here, 1852, by Captain John Smith, and it was actually a half a block away from us, right between De La Guerra, where the city school parking is. It was just on the other side of the city school parking. Both buildings lasted into the 1900s and were eventually torn down 1920 and the 19-teens. The first house that was built in Santa Barbara was built by the gentleman who gave us the Thompson adobe. Not sure if you're familiar with that, but he built this, what is now considered the first Monterey-style adobe in California. He followed that off by building a wooden house, which subsequently burnt down. So it never got its honor as being the first house in Santa Barbara because it just didn't stand long enough to be counted or anybody cared about it. So we're leaving our lumbermen. Our next two guys, Lewis Burton. Lewis Burton owned the property known as Burton's Mound along the beachfront. And he says, he notes there he's got 150,000 redwood shingles available, 100,000 feet of redwood lumber. And it's deliverable at the beach or in the city, because pretty much everything, as you know, gets taken off the boats and loaded down to the beachfront. A month later, he's in business now with two other gentlemen, Blake and Hinchman. And you notice that they are at the steamboat landing. It's a steamboat landing. Where the heck is the steamboat landing? So here's a map of Santa Barbara just about this time. And right here, where my little arrow is pointing, that's just about where Chapala Street is going to be. That is what they call the steamboat landing. No steamboats actually landed there because they could never get out. But that's where the boats the skiffs from the various boats would land at that point at future Chapala Street. So that's where they got all their lumber. Where my little arrow is going now, that's future State Street, and as you can see, it comes down here to where Mission Creek crosses down along the beachfront, and it's pretty much just a swampy, sloughly mess there. So that's one reason why everybody landed at Chapala Street. Now there's a whole business doing this. At first there was just various people would bring boats out to unload the ships, but a man named Captain Marcus Harlow started getting larger ships, and it was called I forgot the name of it. Anyway, his job was to take these ships, lightering. And so he had these large enough skiffs, and so they would go out to the boats that would anchor offshore, and he would load everything up, bring it ashore. And so he brought people off the steamers, he brought mail, he brought goods. Lumber was either taken off ships and just shoved off the ships and it floated ashore, and so you went along the beach picking up all of your lumber. Or sometimes it was put on rafts and floated or towed ashore. But there's many stories, and sometimes, I hear these stories, I go, oh, that's an exaggeration. But I found personal accounts where a woman says that her husband went down to the beach today to pick up the wood for their house. And he had to wait 2 or 3 days before all of it came in. So the house took several days to do. Somebody else complained that the mail bag just gets tossed on the beach. If there's no one at the beach, the guys row ashore from the ship, and they just simply toss everything onto the beach, and you pick up the mail or else it gets washed back out to sea. And backing up one thing, one reason all these ships had to park so far off Santa Barbara, they had to anchor a mile to 2 miles offshore, is because of the southeasters. And so we have Castle Rock, which is City College, well, it's gone now, but it's where City College East Campus is. And the other one by the Clark Estate. We have 2 points that are out there. So if you're closer to shore and the wind comes up, you don't have enough room to tack to get back out in the channel. So you had to be far enough offshore so that when the winds come up to try to blow you ashore, you can get out of the way. And there's quite a few wrecks that happened along Santa Barbara's West Beach where people never made it off, or at Second Point, which is now Shoreline Park. So it was everybody that had a brain stayed far enough offshore. So Mr. Harlow has this lighterage business, and he's bringing stuff ashore, but it costs a lot. 1/3 of all goods coming into Santa Barbara, 1/3 of the cost is because this guy charges to bring all that stuff ashore. So to circumvent that idea, these people say, well, why don't we build a wharf? So in 1865, the Santa Barbara Wharf Company is formed. There's 6 gentlemen that have it. I could only find photographs for 3, Dr. James Barron Shaw, Peter Brinkerhoff, who we have Brinkerhoff Avenue, and we have Charles Fernald for Fernald Point, the Fernald House that the Historical Museum owns off of Montecito Streets. So these 6 gentlemen come up with $20,000 to build a wharf at the foot of Chapala Street. And it takes about 2 months for it to clear the assembly. They had to get permission from the state to do this. So it took 2 months to get all the bills passed and everybody approve everything. Think how long it would take today with the Coastal Commission to try and get a wharf built off of Santa Barbara. I mean, so the wharf opens in 1867, late 1867, 1868. Now the problem with this Chapala Street Wharf, as they eventually called it, it's 14 feet wide and 700 feet long. 700 feet is less than 2 city blocks, so it really doesn't sit far enough out to sea for the large ships to tie up to it. So what's happening, Captain Harlow is now going out to the ships, bringing all the goods up to the side of the Chapala Street Wharf, where there's a stairway that leads up to the top of the wharf. Well, the problem with that is that you're bouncing up and down in the waves. It's soaking wet, so people really don't like getting off the lighters and then try to get up the stairs to go out onto the wharf. And sometimes people complain that there's a rush of passengers coming down as passengers are coming up. They're trying to carry the cargo. Stuff is getting tossed into the sea and falling over. So it really wasn't working out well. So John Peck Stearns says, hey, I will add more to your wharf. I will widen it to 24 feet. I will lengthen it another 1,000 feet. And then here at the end, I'll lengthen it 1,000 feet, and then we'll put a little bend on it so that it's along with the current of the ocean out there. And I'll make that 60 feet wide, another 150 feet long. So now it'll be deep enough that the large ships can actually just tie right up, unload passengers and goods, and away we go. They said, no, thank you. Don't want to do it. So he said, all right. So he goes to the city council, puts up a petition for a wharf franchise and says, I want to. He does this a month later after he makes the proposition to the wharf company. So he says, I want to build a wharf, presents it to the city of Santa Barbara, and the city council says, as they do with everything currently, they said, yeah, well, we'll think about it and we'll let you know about it later. So he also offered to put little parklets along there as well for restaurants. Well, this isn't Stearns' first chance at the rodeo. What I find out is a year before all this, so a year before he made the offer to the wharf company and to the city, he had Romualdo Pacheco, the gentleman here on the right. Romualdo Pacheco is a native-born Santa Barbaran. He has been a politician in Santa Barbara and San Luis Obispo counties. He's been assemblyman, state senator. He will be lieutenant governor and then governor, the first native and only so far, the first and only native-born governor of California. He's also a staunch Republican and has been backed heavily over the years by Mr. Stearns. So I find that it's very interesting, a year before all this stuff officially happens, Senator Pacheco introduces a bill at the California Assembly to allow John Peck Stearns and his, quote, associates to build a wharf in Santa Barbara. So he'd already set the path knowing he wanted to build a wharf, but he approached the wharf company to save some time. They said no, so now he's got the permission from the state senate. He's got the permission from the city council, or the city council convenes and says, yes, we'll go for it. So he's ready to go. Except he's missing one thing, which is money. Now, he's not poor. He's got $5,000 in his own real estate. He's got $10,000 in his personal estate. But he approaches the leading citizen and philanthropist for Santa Barbara, Colonel William Wells Hollister, and asks him for a loan. Hollister at first wants to take a percentage of the wharf rather than loaning the money. He says, well, I'll loan it to you, but I want a percentage. Hollister's great-great-grandson, J.J. Hollister, told me that, yeah, he never invested in anything where he figured it would fail and he couldn't get the whole thing by the time it was done. And so he said that's probably what he was thinking, which he was, because he said, Mr. Stearns, I'll give you $41,000, forget about the percentage, but you pay me $500 a month, and if you miss one payment, the wharf goes back to me. Smart guy. Well, Stearns says okay, and so they're almost ready to go because they got the money. They've got a lot of wood, but what they don't have is a pile driver. You can't just build a wharf without a pile driver, and this is a pile driver, and there's a little steam engine, and it raises this pole right here with a huge weight on the end, and it puts a big round piece of piling and then pounds it down into the ground some 40 feet so that you have a nice steady and sturdy piling to put your lumber on to then build your wharf. There's only one of these in the south coast of California, maybe in all of California, and it belongs to a man named Albert Salisbury and his partner Donald Fraser. Currently, they're down in Ventura at the Hueneme Wharf that's being built. So as soon as they're done down there, they'll come to Santa Barbara. So Stearns has to wait till they're finished down there. They arrive in the summer of 1872, and this thing is built fast. I cannot believe how quickly, I don't want to make any jokes about how things take today, but within 3 months, Stearns Wharf is ready to roll. I mean, all the lumber, all the driving. Can you imagine how this must have sounded throughout the city? Bam, 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 bam. Well, there it is. It's done and opened on September 14th, 1872. The schooner California, which its manifest says it has 100 pilings, 80,000 feet of lumber, and 80 barrels of lime for Mr. John Peck Stearns. It arrives but does not anchor on the wharf. It's just sitting off a little bit. Next comes the Annie Stouffer, and she's got 160,000 feet of lumber and 100,000 shingles for Mr. Stearns. The next day she pulls up, it's September 16th, she pulls up and ties to the wharf, the very first ship to actually tie up. And as a happening, the captain of of both ships come out and Stearns break a bottle of champagne. So the official date is September 16th, and Stearns Wharf is in business. And this photograph, I think, is the first and the earliest, or at least the earliest photograph I've seen so far of Stearns Wharf. It was taken by E.J. Hayward. He came here in December of 1872. So looking at this picture, and also on the very end, you can see that little pile driver at the very end of the wharf. And Stearns was still, even after the ships arrived, he was still extending that bend out there on the end of the wharf there. So I find this is probably late 1872, early 1873. There's still a small problem, though. Stearns has the wharf. There's a comparison between the Chapala Street Wharf. But Captain Harlow, who had that lighterage business, he seems to have some pull over the steamers that are coming to Santa Barbara. And they won't tie up at Stearns Wharf because of Harlow. And he wants Stearns to buy him out. Stearns says, forget you. I don't want to buy you out. I don't need you, don't want you. And eventually, though, a renegade ship that Harlow has no control over, a steamer ties up, unloads, and everybody's going, this is so much better. So the Pacific Coast Steamship Company, the main company, they go, this is great. It used to take more than 90 minutes to load and unload passengers and get them to the Chapala Street Wharf or else just ashore. And now they're just simply tying up. Passengers walk straight out onto the wharf, lumber is unloaded, and off they go. So there's easily a couple hours worth of saving with all the preparation that they used to have to do. And so here is a happy couple coming down into Santa Barbara as it looks. So this is probably 1875 to 1877. I was sitting with Chris Urban out at the museum here. We looked at this picture, and he noted the planking still is along the edge here, hasn't been cut and trimmed to match the side of the wharf. So this is very, very early. And what I like about this picture is this truly projects that John Peck Stearns opened the door for Santa Barbara. Now, we're just becoming a health resort, so this is great to get people to come straight off the boats, easily come into Santa Barbara, and we're getting a lot of people, a lot of building, a lot of hotels, so the timing is perfect. And just by comparison, here's 3 years later, and notice they put fencing up all the way along there to keep people from falling off. I can also tell this little dot by the Mission is the Orania Mansion where Roosevelt School is today, and so that dates this to no earlier than late 1878. But you can see how Santa Barbara is changing. A lot more houses, a lot more wood. I mean, tens of thousands, no, in 1 year alone, 10 million feet of lumber came into Stearns Wharf. Basically, any house in Santa Barbara built before 1920, the wood came from through Stearns Wharf. So here's just some fun. Here's some lumber ships tied up at Stearns Wharf. And you can see lumber that's just lining the roadway there, stacked up, waiting to be taken ashore to the various lumber yards. This one, you can see one of the steamships has tied up. Passengers are coming off. Stearns also built this little house at the end, so in case of inclement weather, they could go directly into the little thing and get warm and have some beer, wine, or hot cocoa. What I also like about this picture is there's a couple walking along here with their child, and the child is walking across the stacks of lumber, which are not tied together. And back then they just figured if you slip on something and break your shoulder, well, you're an idiot. So you're not going to sue anybody because you don't want to be branded an idiot. This photograph, Chris and I studied. We really enjoyed it because we're wondering, how do you get all the lumber off the ship? So it looks like that on the mast, there's a spar here. There's a pulley at the end, so it looks like it could swivel, pick up the lumber, and drop it ashore. But there's also this pile driver here. And I don't know if the pile driver is continuing to put piles into the wharf or if somehow that is being used to move cargo and lumber. What's also interests me is there's piles of stuff down here. It looks like a pile of dirt and a pile of asphalt. Now, Moore's Landing out at Moore Mesa, there was a lot of asphalt being dug out there, and Mr. Moore had his own asphalt mines out there, so he was shipping asphalt from his wharf up to San Francisco and other places that needed asphalt for roads, etc. But there's a log notation at Stearns Wharf that notes that they had I forget how many tons of asphalt that was loaded from Stearns Wharf onto a ship to be taken to Moore's Landing. So for some reason we took asphalt and dropped it off up at Moore's. I don't understand why, but I can't argue with that. Here's that engine again on the opposite side of the wharf. And I just got to find out more information about that. But again, more and more lumber tied up. Now, I know you're all wondering, Neal, what happened to the Chapala Street Wharf? Well, this is probably the last picture showing the Chapala Street Wharf down there and Stearns Wharf behind it. They kind of look like two wharfs stuck together. In January of 1878, there was a massive storm that hit Southern California. It destroyed the wharves down in Ventura and down at Carpinteria. And in Santa Barbara, the history has been written that a Chinese junk that was moored west of the Chapala Street Wharf lost its ropes and went through the Chapala Street Wharf, and it and all the timber then hit Stearns Wharf, tore a hole through it. Well, I looked a little further into it and found that actually the first ship that caused all the problems is our dear friend Captain Marlowe, the man who had the lighterage service. And it was one of his old boats that was sitting abandoned up on the beachfront that got caught by the waves, dragged out to sea, hit the Chapala Street Wharf, tore it apart, and then all that debris hit Stearns Wharf. Later, the Chinese junk came through and did its business. But I just find it funny that it was Captain Harlow's boat that did it. It was sort of like it was the last finger that he could extend to Mr. Stearns. Now, it couldn't have happened at a better time because the city was trying to raise the rate fees for Mr. Stearns. And he said, I don't want to, I've built this wharf. I've done all this stuff. I don't want to be charged excessive fees from the city for the work that I'm doing, the benefit for the community. And the city said, nope, you got to pay this fee, and this is what it's going to be. Well, now that there's a big hole in the wharf, there's all this produce and goods at one end of the wharf and a big hole, so it can't come in. Farmers and the merchants are trying to get their stuff out to the wharf, and they can't load it because no ships can come in. So Stearns just sat there and waited and waited, and the community was behind him 100%. All the newspapers, usually the Democrat paper, the Republican paper, the independent paper, all fighting each other going, Stearns, Stearns, Stearns. So the city gives up. Stearns gets his way. He pays a more fair fee. They kind of negotiate it, and he rebuilds the wharf, and so they're back in business again. So Chapala Street Wharf is gone. Stearns Wharf is now working great. And so now we'll move a bit more about Mr. Stearns and his personal life. In 1875, he bought a house. He bought property at the corner of Chapala and Haley Streets and built this house. Looking close up at it, I cannot tell if that's John Peck Stearns, his wife, but it's certainly not their daughter. And they did have a grandson, so he would have been 6 or 7 years old in 1899, so this could be the grandson. I looked closely at this guy and go, oh, look at that. That's his peg leg. But it's his left leg that was the leg. And I found that out because the great register, the voting registers, every once in a while they would note the distinguishing marks on the voters. They could tell you can't change names. You didn't have voter ID back then, but you got a scar. Well, yeah, that's the guy with a scar. So it noted that John Peck Stearns was missing his left leg. Still don't know where or how he lost it. So I look at that, and then I realize closer, well, this could be his left leg, and his right leg is crossed over, so that's not the peg leg, that's the part of the stool. So, and the beard's not long enough, but then you can always shave your beard, so I can't say for positive that at this time this was the Stearns living there. But what I did do is I did a close-up on some of the detail on the house, and I found this. That looks like a J, this looks like a P, and then there's the S. So John Peck Stearns and this beautiful scroll work on the front of this house. He later sold the house in 1899, which I'll get to that story a little bit later. As I mentioned, Stearns was always interested in education, and so he was one of the people in Santa Barbara that put up a stock certificate, put up stock to build what was called the Santa Barbara College at the corner of State and Anapamu Street. And this was where the San Marcos building was, where what's there now, Old Navy or something? It changed so fast, I can't keep up with them. But Woolworths, as far as I'm concerned, it was the Woolworths store. So they built the Santa Barbara College. Now, this is really an unsung piece of Santa Barbara history. This is one of the most important buildings in Santa Barbara's history. Aside from the Potter Hotel, this is real close because down here at the bottom we see one of the trustees, T. Wallace Moore. T. Wallace Moore had a daughter named Martha Maggie Moore. She was a student at the Santa Barbara College. Well, one of the teachers at the Santa Barbara College was a man named Charles A. Stork, and I think he came out of Illinois. The Coopers, Elwood Cooper and his wife, went back to hire him, brought him to Santa Barbara. As it sometimes happens, especially on the Oxygen Channel, students fall in love with their teachers, and this is exactly what happened. So Charles Stork and Maggie Moore fall in love, they get married, and their child is Thomas Moore Stork, the founder of the Pulitzer Prize-winning News Press. So without this college, it never would have happened. We would have been stuck with an empty newspaper. Oh, we already have one, yeah. Publisher Stearns, speaking of newspapers, William Wells Hollister owned the Santa Barbara Daily Press, and in the early 1880 it was suffering greatly, and they eventually, in June 30th was the last issue, June 30th, 1880, last issue of the Santa Barbara Daily Press. John Peck Stearns thought, well, this is a bad idea. We really need a newspaper in Santa Barbara. It only left us with a Democrat paper. We need a Republican-oriented paper, which is what the press had been. So to keep things balanced off, so he offers to buy the Daily Press from Hollister. Hollister's going, great idea. He's going to be stuck with this loser newspaper. Surely he'll lose money on the wharf, and I'll get the wharf back. So this building, by the way, still might be standing minus the top structure, the 500 block of State Street. So the first issue of the New Daily Press is September 1st, 1880, and Stearns hires a man named Theodore Glancy to be the editor for the paper. He's a long distinguished newspaper career, and he has also got a, what would you say, not a poison pen, but he is straight to the point. He's honest, direct, doesn't hold any punches. He's brand new to Santa Barbara and immediately just starts digging into things. There's a gentleman who has been running for district attorney, Clarence Gray. Clarence Gray is as Glancy writes, he's just nothing more than a hoodlum. In fact, I'm going to read this piece here. He says, Clarence Gray is a man with how many aliases it is impossible to say. He has been nominated for district attorney. The charity of our silence is more than he can expect. For the upcoming election, it turned out the Supreme Court, for the reasons I don't follow, said we don't have to have the election. So what Glancy then writes is, thank God we are spared to have officers of the law chosen from among the hoodlums and lawbreakers amongst us. So saying it's fortunate that we don't have to vote for this no good person anyway. Well, Gray is really ticked off about this. This is the 500 block of State Street. We're looking at Haley, corner of Haley and State. So Gray walks down State Street. He sees John Peck Stearns, and he says to him, he got the paper, he says, are you responsible for this? Do you approve of this? And Stearns goes, yes, I do. And Gray mutters and walks away. He then runs into Glancy, just about the middle of the block here, and he pulls out a pistol and starts arguing with Glancy. So bystanders come by and separate them, but they don't take the gun away. They just leave Gray with the gun. So right here at the Morris Hotel at the corner of State and Haley, as Glancy is trying to go into the hotel, Gray picks up the gun, shoots him, blows a hole through his right wrist, which enters his abdomen, exits out the other side. Glancy goes inside, bleeding profusely. They put him onto a bed. They arrest Gray, who claims self-defense immediately. Glancy does die, and so Gray is charged with murder. The first trial is a mistrial. Or a hung jury. They can't figure it out. They send the case to San Mateo because they believe they'll have more of an impartial jury. That particular jury somehow was supplied with 20 gallons of beer, several demijohns of wine, and odious amounts of whiskey before the trial even started. And so that trial was declared a mistrial by the judge, saying we can't have a bunch of drunk jurors who haven't even heard the case yet. So then the case is, 2 more years pass, and the case is tried, and Gray gets off, so he disappears from our history. So he got away with murder. And poor John Peck Stearns, I mean, he just hired this guy. He only lasts 25 days. So Stearns fires another guy, and eventually sells the newspaper to him in December, and life goes on, and the newspaper does well, becomes the Santa Barbara News Press eventually. But for those questions about the news press having this long, unbroken lineage, well, there's 3 months where it wasn't, I heard that, there's 3 months where the paper wasn't published. Stearns had been a strong supporter of the railroad coming to California, and especially getting into Santa Barbara. And when it arrived on August 19th, 1887, there were people that said, well, goodbye wharf, we've got a railroad. Everything we need's coming on the rail. We don't need a wharf anymore. And Stearns did not disagree or agree. What he did was he took his wharf that now looks just like this, and there's train tracks that you can't see coming up here in the Santa Barbara along Gutierrez Street. He gets permission from the council in January of 1888, so just 3 months after the train arrives. He's already building tracks that merge in with the Southern Pacific's tracks. And here we see my favorite little pile driver out there on the end of what's called the Railroad Y. And they're building it out to connect to Stearns Wharf. And by the end of the year, it is connected, and Stearns is now connected by rail to the wharf. So now he can bring produce from other places, unload it onto his ships, bring it to other communities, and unload stuff as well from the train. So it's working out very, very well for Stearns. Here's a picture from Stearns Wharf looking back at the Railroad Y, headed back over, and it connects around by Santa Barbara Street. And what I really like here is the little roundabout that he put out. Years ahead of when we did it, he's got a little roundabout for some reason on the wharf. Stearns experimented with eucalyptus, and this picture is a great picture, part of the museum's collection here. Great picture showing all the eucalyptus piles that he used. So eucalyptus was supposed to be stronger, bug-resistant, weather-resistant, rot-resistant, and it turned out that it wasn't. Its life expectancy was not as good as the redwood and fir that they had previously used. But Stearns put in over 200 pilings over the years as he experimented with it. And the dog is unnamed. Mayor Stearns. Stearns had been elected to the city council in 1875, serving 1 year. He was asked to serve as mayor and decided he didn't want to do that. He was too busy with his wharf and lumber. But in 1888, he accepted the nomination from the citizens, and he ran for mayor and won. Out of 1,337 votes cast, he took 650, where there was 3 candidates, so he overwhelmingly won the jobs. And so he served as mayor for 2 years. And then it's April 1899, and Stearns is in poor health in the newspapers. This is the fun thing about Santa Barbara back then. Everything you did was in the newspaper. If you took a trip to San Francisco, it said, Aaron and James Paul Garcia are headed to San Francisco this week. And you go, great, I can break into their house. But people never did that, so everything about it. So in this case, it says, oh, John Stearns has been very sick this week. John Stearns is not doing well. Boy, it looks bad for him. Oh, he's recovering a bit. So there's always update about everybody. So they report that he's sick. They report that his daughter comes down from Sonora to visit him. And in August of 1899, he then sells his cherished house on Chapala Street in Haley to his associate, Frank Smith, another wharf person, long history with him. And it's 2 days before his 71st birthday. He then boards a private railroad car and heads up to Sonora to live with his daughter for a while. His health continues to decline, and in 1901, he's declared mentally incompetent, and his wife takes charge of him. And then in March 4th, 1902, he dies. It's at the St. Helena Sanitarium. His body is brought to Santa Barbara, where the overflowing services are held at the Congregational Church. He was one of the early Masons in Santa Barbara, so the Masonic Lodge comes and holds the graveside service for him. And he's buried at the Santa Barbara Cemetery, and there's his wonderful tombstone there. And alongside of him is his wife, who passed away in March of 1919. And in her obituary, it was kind of an interesting thing. It said she was one of the first white women to move to Santa Barbara. It's like, well, there was a lot of people before she got here. And it also states that they were married in Marysville in 1860. The license is 1862, but when the 1860 census, Stearns writes, there's a little column for the 1860 census, have you been married within the last year? And he puts yes. So he's saying, I was married in 1860, there's a license for 1862, her obituary says 1860, so you go, well, I wonder what was going on there. I guess when you're district attorney, you can write your own laws. Don't know, but it's just one of the fun parts. So, yes? Back up.
The mayor house, a few slides back, the red, is that when he's elected mayor? About 6 months, a few slides back.
Oh, that, I should have mentioned. That is City Hall. It was in the center of De La Guerra Plaza at the time. I also forgot the most important part of our whole story tonight was when I showed the picture of the lighters bringing cargo and people into Santa Barbara. The deal was that as the little skiffs got to where the waves are starting to roll and break, the sailors would turn to the passengers or the business people and say, got a tip? And if they didn't have a tip, well, it wasn't their fault. If the skiff went sideways in the water, everything got turned over. And so that was the first controversial Roe versus Wade, which took place in Santa Barbara. I can't believe I missed that opportunity when the thing was there. That's when tipping started. As for Stearns Wharf, Stearns had formed the Santa Barbara Wharf Company, the same name as the other one had, in the 1890s, sold it to a group, his friend Frank Smith for one. Stearns Wharf, the railroad Y, started to disintegrate in the 1920s. You can just see some of the pilings sitting there. By the late 1920s, it was gone completely. This is a shot between 1925 and 1928. And there's my little pile driver again, and this was following a storm, so I know that there was a section that got torn out right about there. This pier over here is called the Pleasure Pier that was off the foot of Castillo Street for the use of the bathhouse. And we're just going to run through some fun pictures here of what happened to the wharf. This is the Flying A Motion Picture Studio. They did several films using Stearns Wharf, so that's director George Cox and the crew around him. I think this guy looks like Mickey Rooney, but it's not, but nevertheless. Okay, now the big reveal, something no one has ever seen. You're the absolute first to see this. World War II. Now, everybody has heard of the Japanese submarine that shelled Elwood in February of 1942. But how many of you know about the Japanese aircraft carrier, the Tojo Maru, that was seen in the Santa Barbara Channel in 1943? And it was the most advanced Japanese aircraft carrier there was. It was top secret. It's in the channel of Santa Barbara. And this amazing photo was taken from Stearns Wharf after a torpedo attack by planes and dive bombers, including an American pilot who committed suicide and dove through the deck to make the ship inoperable, and so the Japanese couldn't launch anything. So this was just stunning. This is something that I think has been kept quiet all these years about a Japanese aircraft carrier just sunk not too far off Stearns Wharf. And funny thing about that, it was for a movie. So the Japanese aircraft carrier is actually 25 feet long, but the entire town had a great time watching this thing blow up and burn. Stearns Wharf was closed for World War II, but certain people did get to go on the wharf because everybody knew the Army guys. And the newspaper had reported the gentlemen who are guarding the wharf are eating off a really crappy hot plate. They have a coffee maker that makes 2 cups of coffee, so please bring them goods. So people are coming down to the wharf, bringing them cigarettes, bringing them coffee, bringing them food, and being able to go out and fish on the wharf with nobody's supposed to know that. The movie was called We've Never Been Licked, and we're all adults here, so just leave this one alone. Yeah, it's like a Netflix special. Yeah, we'll leave it alone. I like these photos in the museum's collection of these 3 boys. They're climbing up onto the rope. Now they're sitting on the rope, and the one guy takes his hands off and is balancing on the rope. And that reminded me of an article I found in 1886 where a 12-year-old boy was fishing on the wharf. He fell off into the water. His 2 nearby boys saw it, jumped off the wharf, rescued him, and swam him ashore. The newspaper said, "This should be a lesson to both boys and parents. Children that do not use proper precautions should not be allowed on the wharf." And so here's these guys pulling this off 100 years later. Stearns Wharf changed from commerce to more touristy type things following World War II. Here we have one of my favorites as a kid, the Pacific Shell Shop. We had Bill's Fishing Barge, Norm's Fishing, the Smokehouse, the Harbor House Restaurant, which, Aaron, this started off as the Santa Barbara Yacht Club. Is that correct? Okay, so there's many stories that say yes and say no. So Aaron wrote the book on the Yacht Club. So there's the Harbor House after it was converted into a restaurant. And then we jump to April 14th, 1973. The Harbor House restaurant caught fire, burnt the wharf. The fire was said by some to be electrical. Some said it was Italian lightning. The insurance had just been renewed by George Casagnola, and so there's a lot of scuttlebutt. Nevertheless, the wharf was closed for 8 years. The damage was so severe, and a lot of ideas came up as what to do with it, how to rebuild it. There was many things happened, but finally it was rebuilt in the proper shape. Now, you've all seen a horse fly. You've all seen a house fly. But have you seen a whale fly? I had told one audience with this picture, don't you remember the time that whale got stuck over at Lake Cachuma and they had to helicopter him out and people were going, oh, yeah. So this is a delightful picture. When the Sea Center opened, the petroleum helicopter companies took the fiberglass whale and took it from the airport, and they're just about to load it here on the cradle at the Sea Center. And there was a little baby whale alongside of it, and the baby whale had a sign that said, waiting for mama. So mama's just about to be dropped into her cradle. Well, 6 days after the Sea Center opened, it caught fire. And you can see this truck is already going through the wharf there. And I was telling this to my friend John Allman, who is a Santa Barbara fireman, and for a long time the public information officer for the fire department. And he's on this boat. That's him right there, putting out the fire. What I enjoyed about some of these pictures, these are also from the museum's collection here, how nonchalant everybody is about this fire. In fact, the newspaper reported there were people having lunch at the Harbor Restaurant and at Moby Dick's, and they just were like, well, the fire's not over here, so we're just going to finish our meals. I like these guys. They're fishing and not bothered at all by it. This guy is just too suspicious. He's walking past there. Chris Irvin said, looks like he's got something in his hand. What about a pack of matches? And then I noticed it looks like my friend Royce Woodbury. So Royce will be here tomorrow night maybe, and we'll ask him about that.
What was the date again?
That was in June of, June of 1986. So the Sea Center was rebuilt. The whales did not burn in the fire. They were okay. And then we have Moby Dick's Coffee Shop, another longtime Santa Barbara favorite. And on November 28th, 1998, it caught fire. It was about 9:40 p.m. And actually, my wife Veronica was having dinner at the Harbor House with a friend. And as they got out to the parking lot, everything was fine. They get in their car. And as they're just leaving, they see in the mirror this giant glow. And she said, well, yeah, that's when the fire, I guess, must have broken through the roof. So this did a tremendous amount of damage. Moby Dick's was gone. And you can see there's about a 300, 400-foot gap there in the wharf. Just the pilings are sticking up. Another great aerial shot looking down. And then what was kind of fun was that this is November. And so for Christmas, somebody got a tree out, and this is on the section that was cut off from the main wharf. So somebody got out there somehow, got that tree out there at the end of the wharf. And in addition to fires, we also have giant waves coming through. And I don't know who took this picture. It's been on Facebook quite a number of times, and I would love to give credit to the person that took this. And what I really like about pictures like this is all these people standing out here. These waves are crashing over the planking. And of course, then I think about when I was 17 or 18 and there was a huge storm, and my friends and I jumped the fence at the Montecito at the Biltmore Pier and went out to the end of the pier, and we could feel all the planking getting hit by the waves beneath us. We thought, well, this is really cool. So what I love about Stearns Wharf is that it's still standing after 151 years of everything that nature and man has thrown at it. Earthquakes, storms. There was even a tornado in 1878 that went across it. It's a true survivor, and it survived everything that we've thrown at it. And I think probably the worst disaster, many of you may remember this, but in addition to the fires and the floods, tornadoes, etc., was how close it came to being destroyed by the Joker. And thank God Batman was here to save our community. Oopsie. So Santa Barbara, it started off as a working wharf with goods and passengers arriving here, coming into Santa Barbara, leaving Santa Barbara. In 1888, 4,000 people came in to Santa Barbara through Stearns Wharf. Now the commerce comes from the land instead of the sea. Over 2 million people visit Santa Barbara annually and come out to Stearns Wharf. But one thing has not changed with all the different types of commerce that Stearns Wharf constantly evolved to take care of. One thing hasn't changed. There's one activity. It involves a line, a hook, and plenty of time to wait for the fish to bite. And that's my friend John Allman and his little brother Rick in the wheelchair fishing off Stearns Wharf around 1952. And with that, we say thank you, John Peck Stearns. Thank you, Museum, for hosting all of us, and thank you for coming tonight. I'm happy to take any questions, and really happy to announce that this took exactly 1 hour. Yeah. So, yes.
I'm curious about the eucalyptus use as pilings for the pier.
Yes.
Was he a buddy of Elwood Cooper's? And B, when did they take the eucalyptus out and replace it with something else?
They would have replaced it probably in the early 1900s, because that's when they finally just realized this ain't working. They started in the late 1880s, pieces at a time. And the California State Forestry Department had said that eucalyptus is really great for pilings. It'll last 14 years. And they had not even tested it for 14 years to prove that. They just said it, and so everybody believed it. So eventually Stearns was dead and gone by that time. So I'm not, whoever had the wharf after that, Frank Smith or one of the other companies. Yeah, there's a whole great story in the different people that have owned the wharf and done things with it, and that would take us an extra half hour, so I left those people out for part two. Part two. Yes?
How far back roughly do the planks go? They're really old and rough-hewn, but I assume they aren't original.
No, they're not. The city is constantly renewing the wharf. And one of the things I want to do is go down and start talking to the guys and saying, okay, where is your pile driver? I never see a pile driver out here. How do you get those pieces in there? Because they are constantly monitoring the wharf. They really take care of it, especially with cars coming out, trucks coming out. So it's got a lot more weight on it than it was originally built for. In fact, in the somewhere after the Civil War, there was a Grand Army of the Republic meeting, and some 3,000 people came out to greet the soldiers. And the Santa Barbara soldiers and the soldiers coming for the reunion that were coming off the ships, they were marching down the wharf in cadence, and it started swaying. And they said it was swaying so much that some of the people that were out, there was 3,000 people on the wharf, and they said they were in danger of being thrown off. So they had to, no, everybody, counter step, don't march, don't. So.
Any connection with Abel Stearns?
No connection with Abel Stearns at all. They share the same last name. I could not find anything in their lineage, Ancestry.com, Family Search, all those places I have. I could not find it. But they'll be back there far enough somewhere that they would be connected. Just like our friends in Stevenson County, Illinois. Somehow they'll all be connected. Yes, right in front of me.
That's my answer, now owned by the city.
Yes, the wharf is now owned by the city. Well, George Casagnola had owned it, and I imagine that he eventually sold it to the city, or I don't think he ever gave anything to anybody like that. No, he was a smart guy. As Erin has done a whole thing on the Italians of Santa Barbara, and one of the things that she noted was how much land the Italian families owned, and that's because Mama got the money. The boys would come home, give all the money to Mama. She would buy land, give them a quarter to go to the bars or whatever for Friday night. But they bought land. They invested very wisely and smoothly. Yes.
Was Stearns responsible for the lumberyard that eventually appeared at the?
No, that was not. That was. But I understand that lumberyard at the very foot of Stearns Wharf was not Stearns. That belonged to the Santa Barbara Lumber Company. Stearns Lumberyard, in some of the histories, it says that it was right there at the ocean front, but I've never found that to be true. Looking at land documents, land that he bought, his one advertisement says his lumberyard is at Anacapa and Gutierrez Street. Another one says it's right across from the Morris Hotel where we saw that gentleman get killed in our newspaper wars. His lumberyard was at State and Haley, and I have yet to find a photograph of it, so I've got 3 different locations where his wharf or where his lumberyard was, but it was not in front of the wharf. The other fun thing is wharf and pier. It is a pier by all definition of what a pier is. A pier goes out to sea. A wharf is along the shoreline. But from day one, it's been called a wharf. Although when we were kids, we'd go down to the pier to go fishing, or we'd go to the wharf. I don't know why we called it 2 different things. The wharf to go hang out with the popcorn man. The other fun part is the possessive, Stearns. It does not have an apostrophe after the S. It should, because it's Stearns Wharf. Even from the very beginning, the newspapers, some put Stearns with apostrophes, some didn't. And eventually it never had an apostrophe. Every April Fool's, somebody puts a little thing on Facebook or on EdHad and says the city has just passed a law that they're going to put the apostrophe. It's going to cost the taxpayers $50,000 to change all the signs. And people believe it and get mad and argue about it. It's like, oh.
So Neal, what about Galita Pier? When did that come about?
Galita Pier is around World War II it was built. I've seen pictures that look like it predates the World War II, but there was a pier that was built by the Marines Air Corps along the Galita there, and they were using that for ditching. One thing was for testing pilots, they'd drop a plane over the side and the guy would have to get out so they could learn how to ditch at sea and get out. So that's the most that I currently know about that one. I have a list. I think there was 9 wharves that were built through Santa Barbara County altogether. And so I'm trying to get the first and earliest dates. But the 1940s is the earliest that I've seen for the Galita Pier.
What about Moore Mesa? Was there ever a pier there?
Moore Mesa had a pier. The Moore brothers had a pier called Moore's Landing. It's right by Ron and Pat's house. There's still little pieces of it. There's photographs, a lot of photographs of that, and there's also paintings and drawings of it. So that was off of Moore Mesa. Hence the name, Moore's Landing, Moore Mesa, and the Moore brothers. Yes?
I remember reading at some point about a car going off near the Harbor Restaurant. How many cars have ended up in the ocean?
If I said 6, would everybody believe me? Well, there is stories of cars that have gone off the edge over the years. A Volkswagen. You know, if half of them are true, remember Volkswagens are supposed to float. And so there's a story of Volkswagen went off the edge of the pier and it did not float. And there's also Walker Tompkins tells a story back in the horse-drawn trolley days that two mules that are taking a trolley down State Street got spooked, jumped the track, went down Stearns Wharf where there is no track, and went all the way off the edge, trolley and everything. And these trolleys are heavy, so that sank. Somehow the mules broke free and they were swimming to Santa Cruz Island when last seen. So I have not found the newspaper account to validate that, but it's a great story. So, yes?
When I first came here in the 1960, I remember a lot of cattle traffic between the island and Stearns Wharf, and the smell down there, it didn't really help the restaurant experience at all. Do you have any comments about that?
I'm in favor of it. Her question was in the 60s, she remembers that cattle were being offloaded at Stearns Wharf from Santa Cruz Island, and that it was a strong smell. So I don't have any, I know that cattle were unloaded there was a corral, the Santa Cruz Island Company had a corral at the foot of Chapala Street on Burton's Mound, but that was in the 1850s to the 1870s and 80s, so I don't recall the cattle in my own experience being unloaded at Stearns Wharf.
Was the railroad spur just taken down?
The railroad spur was gone by the 1920s. The little stub that remained is where the Sea Center is currently. And the Sea Center, there was one piece on that, if you remember, was called the Ty Warner Sea Center for a while. And then he had a tax problem and they removed his name. So I thought, well, thanks for the money, Ty.
Neal, thank you so much. That was amazing.
Thank you, Daisha.